All right, can everybody hear me well? Cool, awesome. Well, thank you all for coming today. I'm Devin Brown, the president. I'm serving as president of our Blackwall Student Association this year, and I just wanted to give you guys a quick plug for the organization and ask you guys to join. So, also, our main goal is to increase the academic and social experiences of our students and members in law school and afterwards. We try to do that through a multitude of ways. So we put on the two biggest social events of the law school in the Gong Show this semester and also the Barristers Ball next semester. Quick plug for the Gong Show. We are hosting auditions next week. What dates are they, Tristan? Or sorry, Ashanti? 28th, 29th of September, and October 3rd. Sign-up sheets are on the door of Balsa that are in the basement around the lockers. And then for academic experiences, we have a multitude of different things we do for our 1L students. So Dean Dawson sacrifices her time, and she will teach students how to outline and how to read cases. We even bring back alumni from our advisory board to help our 3L students and members sit for the bar and learn how to take the bar exam. We also do various community service events like you saw with the Hurricane Harvey fundraiser last year that we did with other student organizations. And we also sponsor and co-sponsor social action discussion panels like we have today. So the last thing, our first general body meeting will be next Tuesday during lunch. So I encourage you, please come out. Dues are $15. Please join if you want access to all this stuff and are looking for other ways to get involved in the law school. And now I'll turn it over to Alex. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Alex Rosselli. I'm the president of the American Constitution Society here at Mauer. ACS is a national organization of legal scholars, practicing attorneys, policymakers, and law students who work to push a progressive vision of the U.S. Constitution. This includes pushing back on methods of constitutional interpretation that include strict constructionism and originalism, which often use neutral-sounding language but in fact end up resulting in conservative policies. By bringing these groups together, ACS helps to shape the public debate on a broad range of issues that affect people's lives. And here at Mauer, our goal is to provide an opportunity not only for students to be a part of this national network, but also to help partner with our fellow student organizations putting on events like this and talking about issues that are important to the student body. So, please consider joining ACS. We have sign-up sheets at the tables in both entrances. As does Balsa. And so now I'd just like to turn it over to our faculty advisor who's going to get us started with the event, Professor Dawn Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you, Devin and Alex, for kicking off this Constitution Day event. Yesterday was Constitution Day. Happy Constitution Day. It's good to be with all of you commemorating it. As we today, this year, choose to examine the vital constitutional issues raised by the recent horrifying, deadly events in Charlottesville, Virginia. I will introduce the panel just very briefly, then each of us will speak for only 5 minutes, and then leave considerable time for your questions and comments and discussion. I'm going to pause at about 12:45. Unfortunately, I know some of you have class 12:55, so we will then continue until 1. So I'd like to first not say much about our panelists other than to say what a privilege it is for me to be here with my fellow faculty members, Professor Kevin Brown, Professor Janine Bell, Professor Lauren Robles, who is now serving as our provost and who for years has been the one sponsoring our Constitution Day events here at the law school for the whole IU and Bloomington community. So it's wonderful to be with you. And so we're just going to all share our initial thoughts and perspectives, as I said, for just about 5 minutes. And what I thought I would do is mention the constitutional framework. I teach constitutional law. I thought I'd mention 3 constitutional provisions that are relevant to these events as a way of introducing the conversation. Start with the First Amendment. So we're all familiar with the core principle that in our great experiment in democracy, the way the founders chose to set it up, and it could have been done differently, but the way it's been working quite well. We're surviving, at least, which is something they weren't sure about at the founding. A core principle is the government may not silence speech, expression, based on the content of that speech, or based on a fear of a hostile audience reaction. There's no heckler's veto. That's a core principle. We're not going to try to examine whether that's right or wrong, though I will have a few quotes from our great Supreme Court Justices Holmes and Brandeis about why they chose to go this route, and it really has worked, in my view, quite well. So, briefly to just mention Provost Robles' statement. I'm not going to quote, but preempt what she has to say, but she issued a university-wide excellent statement on the core principles that are at stake here, and I urge you all to read that. Quite similar, building on what Justices Holmes and Brandeis had to say 100 years ago when they began to build and develop the modern, robust protections, and in both cases, beginning with the idea that in order to figure out what principles we want to guide our interpretation of the First Amendment, and here's what Holmes and Brandeis said: we must bear in mind why a state is ordinarily denied the power to prohibit dissemination of social, economic, and political doctrine, even which a vast majority of its citizens believes to be false and fraught with evil consequence. And they were talking about the most extreme threats of that time: totalitarianism, communism, world domination, Nazism, on the march at a time when the threat was very real. Their response was, if that kind of ideology is to prevail in the United States, so be it. They said the fact speech is likely to result in some violence or in destruction of property is not enough to justify the suppression. Our country is premised on those views. And the reason is we are a democracy. This is a great experiment in democracy, and it rests on a vibrant right of free speech and assembly, without which we could not have self-government, because it's we the people govern. We the people serve as the censors of our government through political action and elections. The government does not censor us. That is the core principle. So what I want to emphasize is that counter-speech, counter-protest in the way Justices Holmes and Brandeis developed this theory, it's not just like a tangential thing. It's at the core. It's what it's all about. None of this works if we, the people, when we hear something we don't agree with, don't loudly, bravely, courageously, again and again, denounce it. And so I was going to read, I'm not going to, this great quote from Whitney versus California 90 years ago. Go and read it yourself, from Justice Brandeis and Holmes, where they lay out why this works, and this works better than anything else, is really what it comes down to. That the First Amendment, the goal is to empower us, we the people, to create our own government and our own society that reflects the values that we choose. And vital to that, again, is our speech, personal engagement in the process. When we talk about horrific, hate-filled protests like we saw in Charlottesville, the First Amendment demands that what we talk about is the substance of it, and what is wrong with it, and what our response is to it. And so that's what this gathering is. This is counter-speech. This is a First Amendment counter-speech response to the Unite the Right messages of hate. And we're going to share ideas about how we can stand up and bravely and effectively respond. That brings me just to be much more quick on this, the other two constitutional provisions, the 14th Amendment. So the post-Civil War transformation of our Constitution and our constitutional values, and really in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, require racial equality. They require that we work to dismantle government-created and endorsed systems of racism. The message of the white supremacist protest, rally, disaster in Charlottesville, that was a rejection of our Constitution. That was a rejection of our post-Civil War Constitution, and it's the role and responsibility of each of us to respond to the horrifying messages that came out that day in all that we do. And so that's, personal conversations with family and friends, things we see in classrooms call out racism, to political action. We saw our President Trump's counter speech in response to Charlottesville. Just outrageous, awful, and we cannot moderate our criticism of that reaction that he repeated again just a couple of days ago. On that, I want to mention that when we do speak out in our counter speech, I don't even like calling it counter speech, it's our affirmative message and what we want our society and our Constitution to mean and stand for. Don't do it on their terms. Look to authorities like the Southern Poverty Law Center that says don't go to their rallies and create the kind of publicity that they're looking for. Follow the authorities on progressive social change, and don't do it at the time and place and conditions that the white supremacists are choosing. Political action. Professor Bell will talk about things like hate crime legislation, and you all have other ideas. But last thing I'll say about that, it all begins with self-awareness, recognition of our own privilege, our own place, what we each are capable of. And I just saw on Facebook there's a group in town that I've been somewhat involved with. I'll just announce, meeting on this Thursday, showing up for racial justice. Thursday, September 21st in the library, 6 p.m., things like that going on all the time in this wonderful community in which we live. The final thing, the Second Amendment, I just want to say, is like a wrench in the whole system. So when in the 1980s, there began a social movement to transform the meaning of the Second Amendment in a way that I think is wrong, dangerously wrong, and we're seeing in one way it's wrong, is it undermines the way that the First Amendment is supposed to work. I want to say, though, that it's, when you have white supremacists bringing weapons to these kinds of protests, it changes the dynamics, but I do want to say two things. One, the success of the distortion of the Second Amendment should be a lesson to all of us about the need to engage in social movements and social change for what we think is right. Second, it's not really so much the Second Amendment. The problem is there's no Second Amendment to bring a gun to a Second Amendment right to bring a gun to a protest. It's the fact that in 35 states, the state legislatures have gone beyond and tied the hands of mayors and police to be able to protect people at protests, which is supposed to be their role there. So finally, I'm going to stop there and say, of the three constitutional provisions I mentioned, I want to just end again with the First Amendment is all about speech and all of us in this context standing up against racism, and none of this will work. Our country will not be what it should be unless we all speak up bravely and together. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me back. It's wonderful to be back in the law school with my colleagues and to see so many law students and community members here. And welcome to our mayor. I always appreciate where's John? There's John. When Mayor Hamilton comes to events on our campus. This is called Perspectives on Charlottesville, and so I want to briefly give three. My perspective as a citizen and a human being, my perspective as someone who has the responsibility in part for the safety of the campus, and my perspective as a teacher. And while I think primarily as a law professor, I also want to contextualize the way we think about the First Amendment in the world of undergraduates who know very little often about it. So just as a human being, there should be no dispute, none, that the fascists who marched in Charlottesville brandishing torches and carrying guns have to be taken with the utmost seriousness and denounced in the strongest possible way. The country, and indeed the world, has engaged in multiple wars to defeat the discredited ideology of white supremacy and anti-Semitism to which Nazis and Klansmen subscribe. My father was in a Nazi prison camp for 2 years, 2.5. I was in Montgomery, Alabama in the mid-60s in the heart of the civil rights movement. These ideologies have to be fought, and actions by Nazis and Klansmen to terrorize a city and a college campus are anachronistic and they're horrifying, as continues to be the terroristic murder of a young woman, the injuring of multiple other people, and the death of the officers who were trying to protect the town. So that's what we're dealing with. Like the vast majority of our citizens, I felt horror because the fascists who marched did so using symbols of terror, such as torches, and were openly armed. And because the racist and anti-Semitic hatred they proclaimed is loathsome. I often tell faculty members in other parts of the university, when you're thinking about your ideas, it's helpful to have somebody around who actually has to implement them. That's maybe the strength of lawyers. So as provost with the responsibility for the campus, my first thoughts after my human reaction to Charlottesville was, could such a thing happen here on our campus? Indiana University is home and workplace to thousands and thousands of people. I'm committed the best I can be to the physical safety of our community and to their right to work and live without disruption. And our university is also the steward of public facilities, the beautiful grounds that you see here, and we're charged with the protection of the campus physical environment. On 2 scores, what happened in Charlottesville surely could not happen here. With the exception of law enforcement, IU bans possession of firearms on Indiana University property, and this is true regardless of any permit to carry a firearm. We also prohibit possession of dangerous articles or substances as potential weapons. So we would take people off the campus. In fact, did so yesterday for not protesters, just an ordinary bad person, for having weapons. We also ban open flames, including explicitly torches. And this is not because we were particularly prescient. Our ban on open flames was mostly incense in the dorms and candles and grills, but went very quickly to torches after Charlottesville. So the most horrifying acts in Charlottesville are forbidden on our campus, and law enforcement would have removed anyone in violation of these policies from the campus. But as I wrote to the campus last week, we are a public university, and the First Amendment's provisions for free speech and free assembly apply to us full force. And as Professor Johnson said, that means in practice that we cannot and will not limit speakers or visitors to the university solely on the basis of their views or beliefs, nor will we prohibit the expression of objections to speakers solely on the basis of their points of view or beliefs. And this would be necessary on a university environment, I think, even were we not bound, as we are, by the First Amendment, because speech and counter-speech are essential parts of an environment of academic inquiry and free expression. Constitutional protections for freedom of expression require that the university be viewpoint neutral. That is, that we don't discriminate on the basis of the content of speech because a trustee or the university president or I or some member of the community disagrees with it. Indeed, as Professor Johnson noted, the Constitution protects speech even if we vehemently disagree with it, and even if it is antithetical to our deepest values, such as words that any of us might consider hateful. There's no constitutional exception for hate speech. And that is widely misunderstood on the campus, widely misunderstood. And also means that when someone's on the campus speaking, the university doesn't endorse their views. I mean, it's not an endorsement of the views of a speaker that the speaker is speaking on our campus. It's an endorsement of the First Amendment that a speaker is speaking on our campus. We can and do impose reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on speech, and primarily for the purpose of assuring that people can go to work and go to class and learn and do all the things that we're supposed to be doing on a campus like this. And we can require people to use university protocols for accessing facilities so that we can try to keep things that are going to be particularly disruptive out of academic buildings, and I'm very committed to that. And of course, we'll make every effort we can to protect invited speakers, their supporters, and protesters from physical harm without regard to the views or identity of the speakers. So, and we'll exclude people whose speech includes or incites specific threats of physical violence or destruction of property. Now, these are principles of law for the most part, and that they mean that it may be a very challenging year for our community, and particularly for our community's commitment to values of equality, non-discrimination, critical thinking, compassion, and freedom of expression. Faculty, staff, students, the people in this room, we all hold very strong views about many of the issues facing our country, and we expect robust and civil conversations and disagreements to occur on the campus. And faculty and student groups also invite a variety of speakers to the campus, and I think anybody who watches the news knows that right now campuses are also the target of a particular skein of speakers whose goal is to provoke violence often on campus. These legal principles, however, don't begin to answer every question I have to deal with as provost. They don't, for instance, tell universities how to think about the enormous security costs that are being imposed on campuses by controversial speakers, like the $600,000 that Berkeley just spent to protect a controversial speaker. I find myself, as someone who knows that the university runs on public tuition dollars and public funds, and the generosity of donors, quite disturbed by the idea that we can be pushed into having to spend money like that, which is, many scholarships, many research labs. Nor do they answer the question of how concerned citizens who oppose the views of those whom IU may be required to let speak approach the difficult questions of how to protest. But on this, I want to echo Professor Johnson's recommendation of the Southern Poverty Law Center's 10 Ways to Fight Hate, a community response guide. It's terrific. Take a look at it. And finally, these principles weigh but ultimately reject as a matter of law emotional harm, quite real emotional harm, such as the disruption of the learning environment and the creation of fear for religious, ethnic, and racial groups on campus as a reason to censor or ban odious but otherwise non-threatening speech. These are painful truths, which mean we need to think hard about how to support our community members in such situations. And finally, as a teacher, I just want to urge people to think about the underpinnings of First Amendment principles that Professor Johnson was talking about. It's hard to emphasize strongly enough how misunderstood these principles are by a lot of citizens, by many of the undergraduates with whom I work. We've faltered as a nation often around speech issues. Think of the Smith Act, the Alien Sedition Acts. But by and large, we've moved over time to more speech protective, more more speech protected policies. And anyone with a historical memory will understand that while there are good arguments to be made that the First Amendment protects the rights of the powerful, that it's also the only thing that protects the power of the vulnerable. And so we need to keep that in mind as we have these conversations on campus. So I look forward to the rest of the panel. I appreciate being back, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to talk about the Constitution with respect to speech and make a few distinctions between hate crime and hate speech. There are actually different protections for hate speech, and hate crime doesn't actually have protection. So I'm going to make those distinctions. All right, so the Supreme Court has said that hate speech is not protected. Is protected. Hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. What's hate speech? Scholars have defined hate speech as extremely harsh personal insults and epithets directed at an individual's race, their religion, their ethnic origin, their gender, their sexual orientation. You can also include gender identity and a host of other categories. You can also think of hate speech as any form of expression deemed offensive to any ethnic group, any religious group, any racial group, or any national group. So in the case RAV versus St. Paul, this is a 1992 case, the Supreme Court said that the First Amendment prohibits states, and that would include state institutions like a state university, from penalizing the use of hate speech. So hate speech is protected. Hate crime is treated very differently. So what's a hate crime? Hate crimes are acts or threats of violence or harassment motivated by prejudice on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, all sorts of different categories. Those categories vary by statute. They may range from murders or assaults to property damage, and they're often committed by members of one group against members of another. So who's protected by a hate crime law? This is a trick question. Who?
Everybody in this state.
Right. Very good. I'm going to get to that later, right? But exactly, nobody in the state of Indiana is exactly right. But in places with hate crime legislation, everyone is protected. If you have a race, and my sense is that's everybody, then you are protected under hate crime legislation that mentions race. And this is one huge misunderstanding with hate crime legislation, so I just want to get that out of the way. All right, so Wisconsin's hate crime law was challenged on First Amendment grounds, and the Supreme Court said that the law that was challenged was constitutional because hate crime laws do not impact the First Amendment because they pay attention to conduct as opposed to speech. They criminalize, so bias crime laws criminalize conduct, they do not criminalize speech. All right, so we can have hate crime legislation. Well, we don't have hate crime legislation here in Indiana. Indiana is one of 5 states without hate crime laws. Hate crime laws have been proposed here in the state, and each year hate crime laws fail to pass. Opponents say that these kind of laws are just not necessary. We have all the tools here to address hate crime laws that we need. The prosecutors with whom I've spoken throughout the state suggest differently. They don't feel that there is There are sufficient tools to address hate crime legislation, and I'm going to talk a little about why. So what happens when you have a bias crime law is that you can adequately address hate crime when it happens. It turns out, actually, that, say take a cross-burning, incidents like cross-burning, they're actually really hard to address under the ordinary criminal law. And you can address it with misdemeanor trespass. And just imagine what it would be like to have a cross burned on your front lawn and the prosecutor to use the misdemeanor trespass law. That might not feel so good, would it? Right? Someone charged with ordinary trespass. That's the kind of sort of remedy we have here in Indiana. You know, that's part of the reason it's important to have hate crime legislation. So there are currently 20 extremist organizations here in Indiana that we know of. Leaders of these organizations nationwide have promised more activity. And right now, without hate crime legislation, Hoosiers who are targeted by extremist activity are largely unprotected. And the second reason I argue that you need hate crime legislation in the state is that once there is hate crime legislation, you develop institutions that recognize bias and end up changing culture. And these include police bias units. These are prosecutorial agencies, victim advocates, all sorts of institutions follow in the wake of hate crime legislation that actually help address bias. All right, I'm going to stop there.
I want to put the protest of those who were protesting against the removal of the Robert E. Lee statute in a broader context. And I want to talk about it in the wake of the 2016 election and Donald Trump's stunning victory. And while I'm not saying or even suggesting that our president is a racist, it's quite clear that white supremacist groups have embraced him as one of their own. And I also want to make a caveat here. When we get into discussions about white supremacy, I am not talking about individual whites or whites as a group. After all, some of my best friends are white. What I'm talking about is a set of ideas that embody the belief that whites are better than people of color, an ideology as the Provost indicated. Now, there's no question if you look at the polling data of the 2016 election, and I put it up there with 2012, 2008, because you can see we have real differences in terms of the way people of color vote and whites vote when it comes to the president and indeed virtually all other offices. But the 2008-2012 election meant something different. It meant that 40% of whites were willing to vote for a black man for president. And indeed, in 2012, they were willing to say, yeah, we did it once, we're willing to do it again. Those were extraordinary statements of inclusion, of a recognition of diversity, of a realization of equality in America. But the Trump election meant something different, because Trump's election and his rhetoric was very much within the notion of what white supremacists would say. He was certainly one of their own, but probably the most troublesome thing about it is that his victory was so unexpected. And that meant that I, like 1,000 other my friends who are people of color, would have had all these conversations with whites about Trump. And I can say in none of my conversations did anyone say anything favorable about him. The conversations were always, I can't believe that he said this. I can't believe that he said that. Who would ever vote for a man like that? And then those election results came out. And what that meant was a lot of people who I and my friends had had conversations with had lied to us in those conversations. We had been told something very different. It is a tremendous loss of trust that has occurred in this country between people of color and white people because of this election. And now we're not sure where the white people stand when they come and talk to us. Because after all, we have this as this major example that we can't trust our friends, our colleagues in the way that we thought we could. Because this is a perspectives on Charlottesville, and I've made it a little broader, I want to conclude with just 3 perspectives, which every time I talk about race, I have to always be conscious of when I'm talking. Number 1 is I understand what American society is. And that means I've always got to reach out to students of color and try to make sure they understand that they belong here in America, they belong here in the law school, they belong here in the university, right? African Americans came to the United States in 1619, the same time democracy came. Our major group of Latinos, Mexican Americans, the United States actually went to them. We took half of their land, and that's what made them part of the United States. For Asians, for other groups, America's a land of immigrants, right? The only real Native people here were the Native Americans. No one else has a right to claim that this is their place simply because they immigrated or their ancestors immigrated here before you did. So the first message is one of belonging to minority students. The second message I always have to deliver is that we always have to fight against racial oppression. There is absolutely no question about that. We have to commit ourselves to fight about it. You got good advice both from Professor Johnson and from Dean Robles about this, as well as from Professor Bell. But then the third message I always have to be cognizant of, I'm a black male law professor. But to put it another way, I've been a law professor here for 30 years. That means I am the longest serving professor of color in any law school in the history of the state of Indiana. Now, I always try to make that point because I want you to understand just how recent we're talking about when we're talking about opening of powerful institutions in this society to people of color. That this is living history right here as we're going through it. Because of that experience, I have to say, when you're 60, you see racial issues differently than when you're 20. Right, I've been fighting this now for 45, 50 years, and I hate to say it, we're going to be fighting this, or you're going to be fighting this for a lot longer. And getting used to the fact that if we are fighting racism, racial oppression, white supremacy, because if we don't fight it, it's going to get worse. It's not that it'll go away. I mean, one of the conversations I had with Professor Williams on this, once you get cultural ideas established, they're extraordinarily difficult to stop. So we'll be fighting this for a while, but we must dedicate ourselves to that fight. Thank you.
Okay, now we have some time for questions, and it's going on quarter of, so we know people will have to go now or in a question or two. Some of you for your 12:55s, but we hope many of you will stay for questions and discussion. We have people with microphones. Raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. We'll take a minute to settle down. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a 1L. I do have to go to class, but before I do, I wanted to ask about the recent Ta-Nehisi Coates article in The Atlantic about Donald Trump as the first white president, and how previously the whiteness of the president was sort of taken for granted, and now because of the election of Barack Obama, Donald Trump had the space to run as a white guy, and what that analysis means, and also what its repercussions are going forward for the next cycle.
No way. Are you kidding?
I haven't read it yet,
Yeah.
so I don't feel like a comment.
I haven't read it either. I would say, for me, the thing I'm most concerned about, of course, is the 2018 election. Because if the 2018 election, what I'm most concerned about is so I haven't read the article either, so I can't comment on the article, but what I can say is the thing I am most concerned about is the 2018 election. Because if the 2018 election is an endorsement of Donald Trump, that does mean that this society is headed in ways which I really would not like to see it go. So I think the 2018 election is going to be absolutely critical, and understanding that there are definitely efforts to restrict minority voting that are in the state legislature. You know, the North Carolina new statute on voting, the Fourth Circuit said this thing was laser targeted to exclude black voters. And what you see in Texas in an effort to restrict the voting privileges of Latino voters in particular is of real concern. So
I'm going to say I'm embarrassed I haven't read it, but I've read about it now, and I know that I need to read it, and it's important, but it makes me think, because I can't speak directly to that, some of you, anyone here come to hear Professor Jack Balkin, the Harris lecture last week? And so it just brings to mind his putting the Trump presidency in historical context, as he views it as looking at the cycles of presidential politics, that we are coming to the end. And some of this craziness is because of that. And where we go depends on us. You know, he didn't say it quite that bluntly, but that there's the possibility for substantial change if we take advantage of it. So I just want to really affirm Professor Brown's comment about the 2018 elections and beyond. But I thought Professor Balkin was very persuasive about looking at, you know, the 80s through now as a cycle that is nearing the end, dying out, but where we go next is in our hands. Other questions? Okay, we have right there, woman there.
First of all, thank you to all the speakers. It was really a wonderful variety of perspectives that we got today. My question is about the CNN exit poll and what it would have looked like if we saw young people of various age bands broken out, because that's the way we're going to know the answer to this theory about the end of a cycle and a beginning, is to know how young people voted among all of those subcategories. Can anybody speak to that?
It looks really different with young people. The young people overwhelmingly supported Hillary Clinton. And, you know, that's been all over the news. But, you know, I wonder, right? I wonder what activism, the real answer to this is what the activism by white supremacist organization is going to do to that demographic. Because white supremacist organizations have targeted universities, targeted sites where there are lots of young people. They and the new approach with white supremacist organization is go everywhere, right? Activism in 30 states, for instance, including on this campus. Both the speaker that drew the most fire and cost us, what was it, $60,000?
No, not that much.
Okay, cost us a lot of money, and
Around
the
6,000.
yeah,
but still substantial.
That's money. Right?
It's money.
That's money. Cost Indiana University money, and the targeting of faculty spaces, doors, and walls, and spaces by white supremacist organizations, that was not random. And it was part of a national strategy aimed at getting individuals more on their side. So that can affect what young people are thinking. But then again, so can this.
What I want to make the point, following up on Professor Bell's excellent points, that when I was here last, I was on a panel before the election on voting, and Marjorie Hershey, who's a wonderful professor of political science, was here speaking and talked about how suppressed the vote of young people actually is, that young people don't vote very much. We had a big push on the campus in the last election, and we are part of the Big Ten Challenge for the 2018 election. And I'm very worried right now that the panel that is looking at supposed voter fraud seems to be targeting universities. Because what Professor Hershey noted when she was here before is that if young voters are discouraged at all from voting, they don't vote. And if they don't vote, they won't vote in the future. So voting is a habit you learn. And part of what we need to be able to inculcate in our students while they're on the campus is that voting is a responsibility of citizenship. So we need to be watching that fairly carefully, and I'm kind of worried about it right now.
Other question? Yes?
I just want to add to what you just said about voting. I think voter suppression is the most critical threat to our democracy of anything that's going on in the country right now. I'm much more afraid of what our legislators are doing than I am of the Nazis, because they are taking away the votes of the people that they know won't vote for them. And if we aren't on top of that, all the rest of it is bullshit.
And on that score, keep your eyes on the Supreme Court this year, because there's a really important case on gerrymandering coming out, political gerrymandering coming out of Wisconsin. And I think it's going to be a tough case for the plaintiffs to win, but at the heart of much of what we're facing right now in terms of polarization and extremism is that kind of deep partisan gerrymandering that has gone unchecked for years and decades and decades and decades.
Quite a bit about voter suppression, and there's been movement towards mandatory voting. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Never happened.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about. I think very skeptical in our society with our values that it would ever happen, but I think talking about it as a possibility might help promote the idea of a civic responsibility to vote. The first step is just make it easy. Have voting centers on IU's campus, and get rid of those barriers that, I did get out the vote calling before the last few elections, and it's disheartening when you hear students, many of you are wonderful participants, but, others say, well, I was up really late last night and I don't want to have to get out of bed. I mean, they actually say that to you, things like that. So if they could just walk, down the hall or not go far, they're more likely to vote. So we just have horrible, horrible barriers, and we don't really, we can make so much progress without the mandatory voting option by just making it, recognizing it as a right, and treating it that way.
Thanks to everybody on the panel. Not sure this is working. So question for Professor Brown or anybody else who wants to answer it. I'm interested in the statistics up there. A couple of things I observed. One is that twice as many African Americans voted for the Republican candidate in 2016 as they did in 2008. Together, blacks and Latinos made up about a quarter of the people who elected Donald Trump. And also that it seems that working class whites overwhelmingly voted for him, including in some areas where they previously voted for Obama. All this suggests to me that seeing this as some kind of racist mandate for Trump is mistaken. So I'm curious what people think about that.
Well, I think I want to raise some issue about a quarter of Trump's votes coming from blacks and Latinos. So if you can see there, 12% of the voting of the people who cast a vote were black, and only 8% of them voted for Trump. So that would have given him maybe about 1% of the almost 50% of the vote that he got. With Latinos, it would have been 30% out of 11%. So that would have given him 3%. So maybe between the two, you're talking 4%, which would be 8% of what he needed to get elected.
Okay, sorry if I misread your figures.
Oh.
At least, so a substantial number of non-white people.
Substantial?
Well,
not really.
Yeah, that's what I guess I'm trying to say is maybe no more than 10% of the votes he would have gotten from people of color. So the other 90% would have been from whites. But I mean, there's no question. His election sent a real message to the African American community, and it was not a positive message at all. I mean, I agree. More of us voted for him than voted for Barack Obama, but wouldn't you have expected that?
Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm a Monroe County citizen and kind of politically active. And I'm around a lot of millennials because I'm a landlord and have I'm a land baroness, have a lot of property. And my biggest complaint, and I think this is something that it's overlooked somewhat in talking to the millennials, they were, angry that Bernie didn't get it. They were angry at the Democrats, and a lot of them didn't vote. And I said to them, do you realize there were like 20 other people on the ballot? I don't care. Don't vote for president, but we know if you live in this area, our congressman is an imported billionaire who does not represent us. And so I want to see how there can be a way to get across to people that it's not a one- or two-person election, that it might be more important for us to have voted for the congressmen and the senators than even the president. And coming up in the next election, I just don't see how to do that, and I don't see enough people emphasizing that.
Yeah, excellent point. I think we just have a few more minutes, so maybe we'll just take a couple of others. Why don't we take another on this side?
Thanks. I just want to note, Provost Robles, your comments assuring us that Charlottesville would not happen that way on campus because of the different rules. Of course, it's very different in the city, where we actually are subject to a state law that prohibits us from doing anything, with very limited exceptions, to regulate firearms. So the concept to me, absolutely, the march armed to the teeth of hateful ideology marching through our town, and it's a mortifying idea. I'm actually shocked that guns were not fired in that kind of atmosphere. It's so concerning how public safety officials can protect that. So the intersection of the First Amendment and those not constitutional but state laws is really interesting to and challenging to contemplate, because that kind of march could happen on Kirkwood.
And I do want to take your point there too, that we don't have gates at the campus. Our gates are metaphorical, and they're not going to keep out people with guns. And if you think of a march like what happened in Charlottesville, if it is quite imaginable to me that people could march right up Kirkwood and onto the campus with guns, and then we would be in the position of having to do what we do with the IU Police Department on our side, which is a fine and wonderful force, but it's not exactly, yes, exactly.
And it probably makes sense to prepare, given what I've seen. in conversation with other individuals who work on hate crime in the state to prepare. The Charlottesville police had orders about how to deal with the protesters. And, you know, there was a lot of criticism of the ways in which but they were responding to specific orders of how to deal with people with arms in this particular context.
And I take your point on that too. I spend, as does Professor John Applegate from the law school, who's responsible for public safety at the university, a depressingly large amount of my time preparing for these kinds of contingencies, as I bet our mayor does.
Right down here. I have a microphone coming.
I assume, maybe incorrectly, that the university does not have a way to find out which people belong to which groups that actually have nothing to do with the university. But the fact that there were posters planted on doors in the university scared me.
Yeah.
Is there not, you can't keep track, right, of anybody belonging to outside groups?
Well, we do what I think all law enforcement does. We monitor activity by hate groups. We monitor threats. We monitor suggestions of planned activity.
Were there any threats that was going to happen?
No, not in that case. And the university got those, well, frankly, community members took them down very quickly. But you can't, it's difficult to accept, but the truth is we don't have gates. We don't lock our buildings necessarily. This is an open society and this is an open campus. And people flow back and forth from the world onto the campus and out again. And so we do what we can to monitor and prevent, but we can't prevent everything.
Thank you.
It is frightening.
Yeah. Why don't we end just giving each panelist 10 seconds for any final comments?
I'm glad I don't have to end on that note. The note I really want to end on is I think that what we need to do as citizens and as members of this larger community is to just commit to speech in favor of the values that our country is committed to supporting other members of our community, and to civility and respect when we engage in disagreement.
I'll second that and add political action.
All right, I will end with a statement that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That arc doesn't bend by itself. We have to bend it.
Well, I'll just concur with all three.
Sponsoring and being here. I am glad.